So this is going to be a fireside chat, and that's going to be with Geraint John. He leads the Interos Resilience Lab team, generating data-driven insights, research and analysis on supply chain disruptions, topical issues and best practices for supply chain risk management. Geraint was previously a Vice President of Supply Chain Research and Advisory at Gartner, where he worked with senior executives at leading commercial and government organisations. But the majority of Geraint's career has been as a journalist and editor in the magazine publishing industry. He spent more than a decade covering the global procurement community as founding editor of CPO Agenda, and before that, he spent 5 years as editor-in-chief of Supply Management. So as a journalist myself, it's always nice to interview another journalist. So please welcome Geraint to the stage. Okay, now this is going to be a fireside chat, essentially, so we're going to be talking about various issues. We will be having questions from the floor as well towards the end of the session, and obviously questions that come in via the app as well. But we're going to start off. Hopefully on a slightly topical note, because in recent weeks we've obviously seen major supply chain disruptions again. But this time caused by drought in China and Europe especially, and Russia shutting down natural gas supplies. How do you assess these events from a supply chain risk and sustainability perspective?
Yeah, well, as you kind of hinted at there, Scott, I mean, it's just literally one source of supply chain disruption after another at the moment, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, if we start with the drought, I mean, I just published a blog on this yesterday, in fact, and while I was kind of doing some research, I mean, some of the numbers are just sort of staggering, really. I think the European Commission just published a report last month saying that I think it was almost half of Europe is currently under some level of kind of drought. That's the kind of worst situation that we've seen in like 500 years. If you look in China, in sort of southwestern China, in provinces like Sichuan, for example, again, the most severe heat waves that they've experienced since they began recording these kind of events in the early 60s. And then, of course, we see similar events happening across parts of the US, in South America, and elsewhere. So it's been pretty serious over the last few weeks and months. We've seen, from a disruptive standpoint, obviously, a couple of examples of that would be, here in Europe, in Germany, the water level in the River Rhine at very, very low levels, causing big problems for German chemicals and automotive and other manufacturing companies who are used to kind of transporting their products along the river on big barges. They haven't been able to use those. They've had to kind of downsize. That obviously has an impact in terms of cost, in terms of logistics. In China, similar kind of issues with the low water levels in the Yangtze River. So, a number of hydroelectric power plants have had to close down or go on to sort of shortened hours. That's had a big impact, again, on kind of manufacturing companies in the provinces affected, which, of course, is like millions and millions of people. Companies, again, in the automotive sector, Toyota, VW, Foxconn, China's biggest lithium-ion battery maker. I mean, the list goes on. These events will have ripple effects down the supply chain. I mean, we've obviously already seen earlier in the year the kind of impact of the severe COVID lockdowns that China has. I think 68 cities currently affected by that. That has a knock-on effect in terms of shipping, in terms of port delays, lead times, etc. So I think the drought or the kind of extreme weather patterns is a major problem. You also mentioned in the question kind of energy. I think what we've seen over really the last 6 months is, it's kind of exposed just how dependent we are here in Europe, but particularly in countries like Germany, on cheap Russian oil, diesel fuel, but particularly natural gas. Russia's now turned off the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Germany still gets 35% of its gas from Russia. Again, we're starting to see the impact not just on consumers, and that could get a lot worse in the winter, obviously, but also on industrial companies, on manufacturing businesses. Some, I think, are already having to stop production, but that could get a lot worse. So, yeah, it's really kind of exposed just how dependent we are on that source of energy. I think there's kind of pros and cons, I guess, from a sustainability perspective. On the negative side, it means companies more like to start burning coal again. We're already seeing examples of that. Depends on your point of view in terms of nuclear, but companies like Germany again were sort of beginning to wind that down. That maybe doesn't look quite as attractive now as it did a few years ago. So I think in the kind of short to medium term, there's some real challenges from an environmental perspective. Hopefully the good news, though, in the longer term is that this will just kind of accelerate the moves away from fossil fuels to more sustainable, renewable alternatives, clean energy solutions, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, both kind of major supply chain causes of supply chain disruption that are kind of ongoing.
Yeah, no, I think I'm right in saying that it was a Sichuan province where they've just had that earthquake as well, I believe.
Well, I think that's right. And, yeah, I mean, obviously there are parts of the world that are prone to these kind of natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. But yeah, it's just kind of one issue layered on top of another, and that's and I mentioned the pandemic. That still hasn't gone away either, particularly in China with the policies that the government has there.
And of course, the reason why it impacts all of us when these events happen in Sichuan province is because of the global nature of supply chains and the impact that that's naturally going to have.
Yeah, and I think we all mostly know just how dependent we are on China for so many goods and services, particularly components, but also raw materials, devices, a whole massive shopping list of items. And yeah, of course, if the factories there, I mean, I mentioned some of the automotive companies, obviously, they may be producing more for the domestic Chinese market rather than for export. But a lot of the other raw materials, components, particularly, produced in those kind of regions will be finding their way by road, rail, sea, in some cases air, to far distant sort of manufacturing plants here in Europe or in the US or elsewhere. And lead times for many of those things have been massively extended over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. These extra kind of events on top are obviously not going to help.
Absolutely, and bless you, by the way. Now, this relates to the previous session, actually, where we were talking about how much do supply chain leaders care about sustainability and ESG issues, given the major disruptions they've had to contend with over the last couple of years. So what's your take on that? Do supply chain leaders care about this, or do they have other issues that are higher up their agendas?
Well, look, I mean, if we're kind of honest about this, of course there are other pressing issues. I mean, we've got, rampant inflation, many commodities, extremely volatile in terms of their pricing, or, the pricing is just continuing to go up. Examples would obviously be natural gas, which I mentioned, things like lithium, huge increases, kind of several 100% over the last couple of years. So obviously, if you're in supply chain organizations, if you're a procurement leader, and you're sort of buying those kind of things, whether it's from China or anywhere else, you're going to be under a lot of pressure. But that's assuming you can get the supplies that you need. So again, this is not new, but supply availability, shortages of many materials, components, and products is extremely challenging. Very, very long lead times continue in some areas. So yeah, I mean, I think that the agenda for executives leading those kind of organizations within companies is extremely difficult. Having said that, I've really noticed a kind of a change over the last few years. Again, both here in Europe, but also in the US, where perhaps they were a bit behind for many years. I think certainly a lot of supply chain leaders do care very much now about sort of environmental and social issues. I think in a way it kind of gives them something, it gives a broader perspective and a remit and a purpose to their jobs beyond being kind of cost efficient, operationally efficient. And of course it also is massively important, as in any other sphere, in terms of kind of talent, kind of acquisition, talent retention, and not just among kind of younger people. We want to feel like we're working for organizations that are doing right by other people and the planet. So I've certainly seen a big shift over the last few years in terms of, a lot of excitement and focus on how supply chain leaders and their teams can actually make a real difference here. But I think, I know you were talking about Scope 3 emissions and suppliers and so on in the last session, but whether it's those type of issues in terms of carbon footprint and so on, or whether it's social issues like forced labour, modern slavery, these are things that get mainstream news headlines on a fairly regular basis, and journalists, of which you're one and I used to be one, we don't care if it's some distant supplier in China or Malaysia or anywhere else in the world, frankly. If you're the customer that we're writing about, we're going to say it's your responsibility and it's your problem to fix it. So I think there are a number of different drivers for companies and supply chain organizations to care more about ESG and sustainability, but I think they certainly do. Things are obviously still changing, but yeah, I've seen a big shift over the last 5 to 10 years for sure.
Okay, you sort of touched on this as well, but what are some of the key challenges that supply chains face when it comes to managing the ESG risks?
Yeah, there are obviously lots. I guess I would highlight, visibility and transparency. So, I mentioned, that the nature of extended supply chains, complex supply chains, where we need to know about, not just our direct suppliers and what they're up to and what their policies and standards and practices are. We need to know about, in some cases, about their our suppliers, or indeed our suppliers. So, we get more and more upstream in the supply chain, and our visibility, frankly, at those kind of levels is still very, very poor. We've done our own research on this, which kind of shows the level of visibility is once you get to that kind of tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 level is extremely low. I was just reading a new McKinsey report yesterday. I think their survey showed that I think it was 17% of companies felt they had good visibility at the tier 3 level. That's not very high, is it? Particularly when we're looking at potential transgressions, whether it's in terms of social practices or environmental practices, and a lot of those happening at that kind of level, or even further upstream. So I think that's certainly a major challenge. Another one is, frankly, is influence, particularly when it's hard enough to kind of influence. And get our direct suppliers to kind of do the right things. Once we start talking about suppliers, then our leverage, our influence dramatically drops, even if we know who those companies are and where they're based and what they do. So I think that's a huge challenge. And then, there are obviously a lot of problems around getting the right data in terms of supplier performance, metrics to evaluate progress, being able to kind of audit that. So those would definitely be sort of 3 of the major ones. I also think, there's obviously a lot of competing priorities within organizations, particularly at the moment with the economics climate that we're all living through. But I also think kind of trying to get internal alignment about some of these issues is is not easy. You really need sort of board level or senior executive level support, endorsement, active involvement and engagement in order to really help to kind of, to make this a priority and for people to pull together. This isn't something that, one organisation, one function can do on its own, whether it's supply chain or any other, frankly.
Do you think there's been a temptation, I'll call it, for some organisations to use the fact that it is quite difficult to get this data and transparency on scope 3 suppliers? Do you think some organisations have maybe hidden behind that? It's convenient in a way that they can use that as an excuse for maybe getting away with, being very careful with my words here. Do you think that the lack of visibility and transparency works in some organisations' favour because they can turn a bit of a blind eye?
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality. But it's not just scope 3 emissions. It's really kind of any type of supply chain or supplier risk. And, I first started asking companies about supply chain visibility or multi-tier visibility about 10 years ago. Shortly after the major earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011, the massive flooding in Thailand, the same year. Not many companies were very good at it then. There was a lot of chatter at the time, particularly in the industries that were most impacted, about how they needed to take this more seriously. Some companies did. I used to work quite closely in my previous job with Cisco Systems. They did a good job, even before 2011, actually, in really putting a focus on this. We see other companies like Toyota, again, sort of, using this as a kind of a springboard to try to get better data, better visibility. But the reality is most organisations, they might have done something for a while, but they didn't really actively pursue it, particularly once they realised how difficult it was. I do think some legislation has helped. Things like the conflict minerals legislation, which I think first came into the US around about 2010, 2011, 2012, something like that. That's sort of spurred some companies to kind of really take this a bit more seriously and start mapping in certain areas. So companies like Intel, Apple, have did a really good job in beginning to pursue that. Obviously, we see other legislation, whether it's around modern slavery or whether it's around carbon emissions, which will force more companies to sort of come out into the open and take this seriously than perhaps they've done in the past. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's very easy to hide behind some of these, admittedly extremely complex and difficult challenges, unless we're really compelled to do something about it.
Absolutely. Now, people often see technology, or use the word technology, as something that's going to solve all of our problems. It can solve some or help to solve some of them, but what role does technology and data analytics in particular have to play in managing supply chain risk and ESG risk in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are really kind of three areas I would highlight. The first one is around the visibility, which I've talked quite a bit about already, and sort of being able to map, in some cases, very complex, extended, far-flung kind of networks. So that is extremely difficult. The traditional way of trying to tackle it for companies that did try and get their arms around this was to send out lots of surveys, to hire consultants, to sort of form a team. But it's a lot of heavy lifting. It's a lot of very time-consuming manual work. And frankly, a lot of suppliers, whether they're your direct or indirect suppliers, don't want to share that kind of information with you. They regard it as confidential, as proprietary. They worry about sort of being disintermediated out of your supply chain if you can go straight to the original source in some cases. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one area where technology can help in terms of trying to kind of map connections, interdependencies between different companies on a kind of a global basis. So that's the kind of area where machine learning, artificial intelligence is beginning to have a real impact and start to make it a little bit more possible, a little bit easier for us to get this kind of data and this visibility that we need. So I think that's one area. Another area will be kind of scoring risk. So ESG is one of 6 kind of major supplier risks that we kind of monitor and sort of automatically score in our platform. Others would be things like financial stability, cyber security, operational risk, geopolitical risk, those kind of things. But ESG is certainly in there. And again, it's about trying to create some kind of dashboard, some kind of scorecard that you can keep live, and you can keep broad. So, the danger of, most companies have typically would focus on their most critical or strategic suppliers, which is perfectly understandable. But as I said earlier, I mean, if you have a sort of a forced labor issue somewhere off at a tangent in your supply chain, journalists, the media don't ask, is that a really strategic, critical supplier to you? They don't care whether you're buying a cheap widget in the low hundreds annually or, you're doing multi-million-pound contracts. They're going to write about it and say you're bad for doing that. So I think being able to kind of have breadth across your supply base, your extended supply base, being able to kind of really try to focus in on, where should we be most worried? Where is the risk highest? Where is something flashing red or amber that we should maybe take a closer look at? That's where sort of technology and data can really help. And then I think the third area would be sort of more dynamic monitoring. We did a survey early in the year, and we found only about 11% of organizations said they were able to continuously monitor events happening across their global supply chains. Now, to us, that's important because speed can be of the essence, whether you're trying to deal with a potential reputational issue or whether it's more of a sort of physical supply chain, potential supply shortage. The sooner we know about these things, the sooner we have awareness, the sooner we're able to mitigate it, respond to it, do whatever we need to do to try to contain it or to work around it. So I think that's another big area where technology can help by just making these events, bringing them to us, taking away a lot of that kind of manual work. So those would be kind of probably the 3 main areas I would highlight. In the future, we're looking at a situation where we have much more predictive and prescriptive data analytics that can really flag things to us before they've even happened in some cases. But that's starting to happen. I see some good examples of that, but it's still fairly early days.
Okay, you mentioned there. Well, let's look into that crystal ball and just gaze slightly into the future. You talked about those sort of red warning lights flashing, if you like. Briefly, could you name maybe 1 or 2 of those that are flashing red for you right now?
Wow. I guess the sort of one of them would be Taiwan. We've seen over recent weeks, we saw, Nancy Pelosi paying a visit, the Chinese getting very agitated about that, conducting some fairly aggressive military drills, firing rockets across Taiwanese airspace. That's a big flashing red for sure. Certainly in Washington, but also here in London and many other capitals. Why? Well, you only have to look at our dependence on Taiwan for semiconductors, particularly the more cutting-edge ones, and not just those that go into our smartphones or our latest, fancy electronic devices, but also into the kind of high-tech weaponry that we're now supplying to Ukraine and indeed to Taiwan, among other places. So, I personally think if China were to invade Taiwan or even sort of blockade it in some way, we would see probably a meltdown in global supply chains in a way that we haven't seen through the pandemic, through everything that's been going on in the war in Ukraine and everything else over the last few years. It would dwarf it within a matter of 6 to 12 months. So that's a huge red warning and slightly worrying one at the moment. Another one in some of the industries that we cover would be the clean energy revolution. We're all busy buying sort of electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles if we can afford them. They're about 10% of global sales right now. But there is a big warning sign over the raw materials. I mentioned lithium, but other things like cobalt, nickel, graphite, etc. Also the kind of the capacity to actually process those and refine them. Again, batteries, those kind of batteries are not just used in electric vehicles, they're in aircraft, they're in defense systems, medical devices, etc., etc. So, the forecasts there are worrying because the global supply of some of those materials and the capacity to process them is limited. A lot of it is in China right now, and there's a theme here, isn't there? But yeah, the geopolitical situation is definitely a big concern right now. It doesn't seem to be getting any better, and those are obviously major issues, of course. Another one is obviously climate change. I've seen over the last few years certainly in supply chain terms, that rising up the kind of risk list, if you like, in terms of level of concern. Again, it's a much longer term issue, but I think the sort of events that we've been witnessing in recent weeks just kind of make that, that if that was, if it isn't red, it's certainly amber and starting to go rather warmer. So, that would be another one.
Okay, thank you. Now, look, unfortunately, we've eaten into our time for questions. But if anybody does have any questions for Geraint, I'm sure they can get to you via LinkedIn. Is that the best way to find you for any questions?
Or I will be hanging around for a little while after this session. So please come and ask me.
But it's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you. And we could have spoken for a lot longer. Please show your appreciation for Geraint John of Interos. Thank you.
Thank you.